Friends, colleagues, welcome to the Crawford School. My name is Tom Compass. I'm the director of the school, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the first Crawford School Reflections. Let me take a moment just to acknowledge the first Australians, the traditional owners of the land that we meet on, and pay respect to their elders, their cultures, their elders in particular, past and present. The Crawford School is ANU's public policy school. Our purpose is leading public policy for a better world. And along with high-quality postgraduate education and research, we care very much about policy impact and policy engagement. And we do this through a number of ways, through direct research collaborations between our own academics and people in the public service and the public sector, to major events, the Crawford School Oration, the dialogues, the roundtables, the secretaries' lunches, and everything sort of in between. And today we're starting a new initiative, thanks in large part to my colleague Bruce Chapman, a Crawford School Reflections series. And John, thank you for starting us off. Very much appreciate you being here in Crawford. The order of proceedings is pretty straightforward. I'm going to ask Bruce to introduce John, and then John will talk for about 30 or 35 minutes, something in that order. And then he's nicely agreed to take questions and answers, or have a Q&A period, and I'll help manage that. And then a quick thank you, and then a bit of a refreshment afterwards. So let me stop and ask you to join me in welcoming one of our own, Professor Bruce Chapman.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you for being here, John. Crawford is a public policy school, and while we give great weight to sound theory and compelling empirical evidence, we're profoundly interested in how good public policy actually works and to understand the practice as well as the research basis of public policy. And I'm about to say something extremely amazing with someone from my background. My time at Crawford and my experience in public policy tells me the following: all truth does not come from an economics textbook. I'm shocked and horrified that I could confess this publicly. This is the inaugural Crawford Reflections lecture. It's a series designed to help us understand critical issues of public policy from the perspective of those who have been and continue to be involved in the process. We seek to learn from the engagement in the policy and the political process, and from those to tell us what they wanted to do at the time and the times of their public policy engagement, what they achieved, what they could have done differently, and to comment on current policy and politics. I'm extremely pleased that Dr. John Hewson has agreed to be the first Crawford Reflections speaker. His history is well known, I think most strikingly as leader of the opposition in the early 1990s and through the 1993 Australian election. This period, this event in Australian political history was preceded by a remarkable political economy manifesto, Fight Back. It was an extraordinary detailed economic policy reform document, presented the architecture for quite a different Australia at the time, although I might say that some aspects of Fight Back have now become part of the Australian fabric of economic policy. I'd invite you to read Fight Back. It had profound effects on Australian political life. It arguably defined the timing of the end of Bob Hawke's prime ministership. I think that would be seen to be a position that many commentators and analysts would hold, partly and possibly mainly because of the inability of the government of the time to fight back against Fight Back, and even arguably formed the basis of Paul Keating's 1993 election campaign. Certainly it did, and his victory. The long-term policy effects of Fight Back are profound and much more significant than would have been anticipated, particularly with reigniting the debate and about setting the groundwork again for the revisiting of the goods and services tax, and with the emphasis on the importance of free trade and the reduction of the then tariffs, although they had been coming down significantly to a position of essentially zero. There are some extraordinary features of Fight Back, and if you read it now, you'll be, I think, surprised, quite surprised, of what this was as a policy document. The features that are most significant to record are its great detail, its lack of rhetoric, and the absence of ambiguity. There was no political smokes and mirrors to hide from with Fight Back. Fight Back was absolutely clear about what John Hewson wanted Australia to look like in economic policy terms. And I think we could reflect ourselves on how this might stand in stark contrast to some other political economy positions that are taken in contemporary Australian economic debate. One of the things I admire about John Hewson is he's able to talk with insight and honesty, humour and intelligence. I've seen him on the TV a lot, and I think that's remarkable, and partly remarkable because he doesn't take himself too seriously. There's not vanity there. There's a lot of self-deprecation. I'm very much looking forward to hearing this lecture, and I invite him now to share his reflections with you.
Thank you very much, Bruce and Tom. It's a delight for me to be here and to have the opportunity to launch this series. I must start by saying that as an economist, I'm very conscious of the remark made by Lyndon Johnson, the 36th President of the United States, to Harvard Professor John Kenneth Galbraith, who'd been an advisor to successive US presidents. Johnson said to him, "Did you ever think that making a speech in economics is a lot like pissing down your leg? It seems hot to you, but never does to anyone else." I'm very conscious of that today. As a failed politician, I recall a remark that's been attributed to various people, mostly to ex-German Chancellor Bismarck. This time I'll use my own words. Politics is a lot like sausages. You are better off not knowing how either is made. So with those two constraints, I welcome the opportunity to reflect in my time in public policy in Australia. I thought I'd just start with some basic first principles that I've always operated by. There's nothing particularly magic about them, but we all come out of university with a black box in our head and we try to apply it as best we can in whatever we do. But I've always had some principles that I've tried to work to in public policy. I start, of course, with a strong personal passion for good public policy. I began my involvement in public policy with a very simple but perhaps very naive belief that good policy is good politics with a relatively short lag. That was certainly the case when I got involved in the early 1970s. I now observe that the lags have lengthened and politics has been redefined to the point where it operates today as a major constraint on even the development of good policy. And that's a theme that I'll develop in the rest of much of what I want to say. As a professional economist, I've seen my responsibility to bring sound policy to bear as the most basic requirement for the development of good policy, and to stimulate and hopefully focus substantive and necessary public debate. As such, it's important to get the economics right, although economists, of course, will debate endlessly what is right. But it's important to get the economics right to maximise economic efficiency, to minimise cost, and so on, so that you maximise the capacity to deliver against the social, environmental, political, and other objectives that are important at the time. However, there are two important constraints. One is that economics is as much an art as it is a science. We sometimes, in some of my students, used to lose sight of that. One of them just been made Deputy Governor this week of the Reserve Bank. I hope he's learned something from that experience. And secondly, we're working to build a better society, not just a better economy. And we need to think about those dimensions when we formulate economic policy. Economic reality is fundamental to, and indeed is more often than not, the fundamental driving force behind so many other policy areas. And I throw in there social, environmental, foreign and defence. It's economic reality, to my mind, that has driven most of those policy areas here and internationally. While recognising the importance of social and sometimes moral roles played by governments, I've had a particular focus on the business dimension of government, that is solving problems and dealing effectively with issues and events as they arise, in effect running one of the largest businesses in this country. In the end, policy in our democratic parliamentary system is made in the cabinet room, where the substance of argument is traded against the perceived politics and vested interests, both from inside and outside of government and inside and outside the bureaucracy, and are finally addressed there and explicitly balanced in some sense. In the context of these principles, then I'll reflect on a few policy areas. In fact, I've picked three that I want to talk about the whole process of financial sector deregulation. I want to talk about fight back, and then I'll focus briefly on a couple of current issues that I think allow us to draw some comparisons with the past. We start with financial sector deregulation and reform. In my time in the IMF, which was in the early 70s, my focus was on attempting to propose good policy based on sound theory in what was a very rapidly changing global economic environment. The key features of that were, the post-war economic stability of strong growth with low unemployment and lower inflation was being eroded rapidly. Secondly, the Bretton Woods world of fixed exchange rates was being replaced by more generalised floating and pressures to globalise economies. Thirdly, you had groups like OPEC quadrupling world oil prices in 1973. Yet in all this, the policy authorities still seem locked into policies that were more designed to defend exchange rates and to control domestic economic conditions than you might have expected given the significance of those international factors. My principal day job at the IMF was as a Canadian desk officer. Canada had been the major dissenter in the post-war period from the world of fixed exchange rates. In fact, it started floating its exchange rate back in 1950. So I often found myself on our formal IMF missions to Canada, having the ignominious task of having to encourage, in quotes, the Canadian policy authorities and governments to stop living in sin, while I clearly believed in the inevitability of generalised floating. Canada was also very active in the whole process of reviewing and developing its financial system. It started indeed with a major study, I think the Porter Commission back in 1964. That's an experience I drew on extensively when it came to define my role in relation to the development of the Campbell process in Australia in terms of the development of that committee and then finally in terms of the implementation of some of its recommendations. I also worked in the US on what were the rudimentary stages of global economic forecasting. We started an exercise to see, in fact, if we could come up with global economic forecasts. This is something today which is taken as a matter of course and very routinely published regularly by the IMF. In those days, it was a very interesting exercise to start and put even countries like the United States and Canada together, let alone the rest of the industrialised world. In my time at the IMF, I also pursued a very active research agenda over and above my day job. I did studies of hyperinflation in Brazil and a number of other significant domestic policy issues in Asian countries. But the bulk of my work, a lot of it with Eisuke Sakakibara, who subsequently, when he went back to Japan, was dubbed Mr. Yen. You may remember he moved financial markets on a daily basis. He and I developed and tested a multi-country, multi-sector general equilibrium model, although the world was in a substantial state of disequilibrium. It was an effective framework for us to address a number of key issues. Firstly, to explain and analyse the existence and development of markets like the euro currency market, particularly the euro-dollar market, but they were emerging in major currencies around the world. To explain the compounding failures of programs like the US exchange and capital control programs in an increasingly globalised world. To explain and analyse the consequences of domestic financial regulations, the rigidities that existed in most financial systems. To further develop the theory and understanding of banking, which I think has been a fairly important part of my life and very helpful in understanding the onset of the recent global financial crisis. And finally, to spell out the detail and the consequences of what we described as a new emerging international financial order. Now, some of this work was very controversial within the IMF because they were struggling to preserve some sort of raison d'etre as the world was moving to floating exchange rates. But the senior IMF management sought on several occasions to block our publications rather than let them see the light of day, even though they were being refereed internally or externally. We found ways around that, of course, by getting the Japanese executive director or somebody to write a forward, Larry Krauss to write a forward, and get our work out. After some 3 years with the IMF, I returned as a visiting research economist with the Reserve Bank. Now, I'll never forget my first day in the Reserve Bank. They gave me a wonderful big office up on the 13th floor, very large office, big old wooden desk at one end of the room. The office was essentially empty apart from myself. I sat there swinging back and forward in the chair saying, now what the hell do I do? Now I'm here. Because there wasn't anyone in the bank that shared any of my interests or experiences in terms of international issues that I'd spent a substantial amount of academic and IMF time thinking about and working on. My first task in the IMF was, sorry, in the Reserve Bank, was given to me by the then Deputy Governor, who became Governor, Harold Knight. He asked me whether, for his personal use, I would review the forecasts that were being done by the Economics Division of the bank. He promised to keep that assessment to himself, so I didn't hold back. But I quickly lost any hope of friendship in that area of the Reserve Bank as well, as Knight soon made my assessment generally public and called on me to defend myself against a room full of people who totally disagreed with everything I said. Not to overgeneralise, their forecasts were basically that there had been a recent uptick in inflation and unemployment associated with a slowdown in growth, and the forecast said that would be short-lived. All the blips that went up would come down, and we'd see a reversal of that process and a restoration of post-war stability, a restoration of trend growth with low inflation and low unemployment. I couldn't believe that they had come to that view, because my assessment was that if you put the profligacy and excesses, policy laxity of the Whitlam years, together with the global forces that I just listed, I found it inconceivable that we didn't face years, if not decades, of stagflation. And as it turned out, that was the case. And with it, essentially, a range of policy challenges that they were not even contemplating. However, I was most concerned about the Australian economy I returned to in late 74, early 75. It was very insular and inward-looking, was over-regulated, had centralised non-market wage determination, it had high tariff barriers, had significant deficiencies in economic and social infrastructure. It was state-fragmented, globally uncompetitive, locked into a fixed crisis-prone exchange rate, with a disturbingly uncompetitive and unsophisticated financial sector, a heavily regulated banking system, where all the interest rates and the exchange rates were actually political decisions. Market forces had absolutely no role in those key prices. And finally, it was characterised with policy advice and implementation that was heavily concentrated in the hands of the Treasury. The Reserve Bank in those days actually only reported to the government via the Treasury, and that usually consisted of the Secretary of the Treasury saying we've taken account of the bank's views, as they put up two options, one they wanted you to take and the other one you'd be insane to consider. So Sir Humphrey or Sir Stone or one of those was in near full control. From my point of view, assuming that the process of globalisation of finance was irreversible, I decided to take, cheekily I guess, every opportunity in the advice that I gave within the bank and the advice that I at times was able to provide directly to the Treasurer by way of a paper, to argue the case for opening up and deregulating our economy. I remember one particular experience there. I think Hayden was Treasurer, I think, if I remember correctly. And I was asked to write a piece on my views of how to change the exchange rate system in Australia, but I was told that I should write it keeping in mind that it should be comprehensible by a 5-year-old child. Although it was a bit rough, but that was a form of the internal debate within the Reserve Bank at the time and the respect they held for the Treasury and the Treasurer. Anyway, I took every opportunity to argue the case that we ought to open up the economy and deregulate wherever possible. Specifically, I began to agitate for a change in the management of our exchange rate with a view to a float in the medium term. Now, given the practice of Cabinet to devalue the rate with each and every run on our currency, that was unrelated to any market assessment of where that currency ought to be, the easiest first step to my mind would be to get the Reserve Bank to start and manage the exchange rate, to announce a different exchange rate every morning and link that, notionally at least, to the trade-weighted index. You could trend it up, trend it down, 2 up, 2 down, 3 down, 4 up, but just get it moving so people get used to the fact that it actually moves as an issue and a very rudimentary first step. Virtually at the same time, I was asked by Philip Lynch whether I'd leave the bank on secondment and become his economic advisor. I refused twice on the grounds that I didn't spend 9 years getting a PhD to waste it on a mere politician. Lynch argued that if I wanted to have real influence on the future development of policy, then this was the place to do it, through him, through his office, directly into Cabinet. He made the point because on the last day I was there, it was near to the point that we were to devalue the Australian dollar in, I think, November 1976. And he said, you have a view about the exchange rate system. I want you to take this piece of paper and a pencil and sit at my desk and write me a one-page cabinet submission setting out how we're going to manage the exchange rate going forward, because despite what Treasury thinks, we are actually going to devalue this currency and move on. And so we had a 17.5% devaluation at the time. Now, I didn't advocate 17.5%. I thought 10% with a change in the management of the system was enough, but it's probably not well known how that 17.5% came about. I mean, the Treasury begrudgingly in the end, as they always did, finally said, OK, let's recommend a 7.5% devaluation. And, you know, you'll have to do a whole lot of other things to validate that exchange rate. It was always the Treasury way. Use the exchange rate as a club to force the government into doing other things in terms of the adjustment of domestic policy. Fraser asked them whether 7.5% would actually stop the massive capital outflow, which was accelerating daily. And they weren't sure. So he said, what about 10%? They still weren't sure. What about 12.5%? They still weren't sure as it came down after a bit of internal consideration. Well, what about 17.5%? Shit, that'll do it. And so we got a 17.5% devaluation, which had nothing to do, as I say, with market reality. The key economic policy decision-making group in the Fraser Cabinet was a Monetary Policy Committee. And that was essentially 7 people, essentially controlled by 4 farmers. Tony Street, an Industrial Relations Minister, Ian Sinclair, Doug Anthony and Fraser himself as chair. So the other 3 didn't matter. John Carrick or Margaret Guilfoyle or whoever was Treasurer, Lynch or Howard, didn't matter. Although some of those treasurers told different stories when they got out of there. Actually, the decisions were well taken before they got in there. And as you can imagine, that quartet always found it impossible to think about putting the exchange rate up. It was always going to go down to the benefit of their farm. They could never contemplate the possibility that interest rates might need to go up. There's an inherent asymmetry in farmer-dominated key policy-making committee. But Fraser invited myself and his economic advisor, John Rose, to formally advise that committee behind the scenes, and to start to attend, and we did nearly all the meetings from then on. We seized the opportunity to start to force the pace on deregulation and reform, and particularly in the finance sector, and to open up the whole advisory process. As I mentioned, Treasury were the sole source of advice, and they nod and a wink. The governor used to attend, but they'd sit there and say nothing. So we convinced Fraser that he ought to have the RBA attend in their own right. And on the first occasion, when somebody in Treasury, might have been Stone, said, "Look, the bank agrees with me," the governor said, "Well, I'm not quite sure actually," and that opened up the debate. But we broadened the advice. You need competitive tension in the advisory process. It's very important. And they were only getting one view, and as I said, they're only getting 2 options, and one of them they couldn't possibly contemplate. But in that process, then, we encouraged them to start thinking about tendering for bonds and notes and ultimately auction systems, because they'd set a price, the interest rate, and it wouldn't sell enough government paper. We got them to approve the formation of a currency futures market, start a grey market out there with a price on the currency that was different to the price the Reserve Bank was setting on a daily basis, and ultimately the formation of the Campbell Committee to review the financial system as a whole and recommend the whole process of deregulation reform. Now, I fought long and hard for Campbell. In fact, I proposed it first to Lynch, finally got Howard to consider it, working principally, though, on Fraser to get the job done. And I drew a lot on my Canadian experience. But the key was you needed a truly independent person to chair it, and that was Keith Campbell. He wasn't going to be anybody's bunny. I helped to also handpick the rest of the committee, so there was a balance in there, but it wasn't going to be dominated by any particular force. You needed a cross-section of talent and experience. We thirdly needed a genuinely independent secretariat, which is what we got, and Fred Argy was made, he resigned from the Treasury, I think, or in effect, and they needed to be adequately funded so that they could bring in the best talent in Australia and globally to actually bring the best, hopefully bring the best recommendations forward, and then to ensure that there was zero political influence on the whole process, either from the bureaucracy or from the politicians. So the keys were, I think, independent and public. The Treasury, and to a lesser extent the Reserve Bank, were very keen to protect their position in the policy-making process and their control over the financial system. Something we used to call in textbooks moral suasion. I found it quite immoral the way it was exercised on several occasions. I recall Treasury Stone telling Lynch, for example, to whom I, as I said, first proposed the Campbell-type inquiry, that the last thing we can afford right now, Treasury, is for the finance sector to be taking a look at themselves. It would cause chaos in financial markets in the streets of Sydney and so on. That was the extent of the objective advice he was getting at Treasury, and of course it tends to frighten politicians until they can prepared to take the risk beyond that. So even though the bureaucracy were opposed and worked hard to knock it off or at least contain it by seeking to constrain the terms of reference, the committee process put them in the same boat as every other vested interest in the process. They had to stand up and publicly testify to defend their position. And not even Treasury nor the Reserve Bank could actually stand up and in the end defend the indefensible. And so their views changed in the course of the Campbell testimony process. And especially in the face of mounting public support within the financial sector and more broadly here and overseas. We were encouraging that wherever possible, getting the Treasurer to deliver speeches all over the place about how important financial sector deregulation was, various conferences and so on. But the process of public testimony was crucial to expose the vested interests and hopefully in most cases force a rethink. As I said, the Treasury and the Reserve Bank didn't want to reform and they didn't want to deregulate. The banks were prepared to wear deregulation provided you didn't licence foreign banks at the same time, take off all our restrictions, lending restrictions, interest rate restrictions, but don't licence any foreign banks. You can see parallels in various arguments you've heard from the polluters these days. While the merchant banks often spoke in favour, publicly, of a deregulated and reformed financial sector, they didn't particularly want it because they made the bulk of their money by working around the existing regulations in grey markets and other transactions, which is where they made all their profit. The finance sector unions didn't want financial sector deregulation really because they had a fairly tight control over the banking sector as a fairly highly unionised sector. The possibility of licensing a whole range of new institutions and deregulating some of the existing ones worried them that they might lose that hold. And finally, key politicians tended to wax and wane. I mean, depending on the day with somebody like Howard, he would be very strongly in favour of it, then he'd go for lunch with a banker and he'd come back saying, oh, I think we've got real risks with this one, we ought to leave this one alone. And so by the time Campbell's very thorough review and recommendations were made public, there was a significant global constituency for reform. And there were great expectations as to the likely substance of that reform. But that didn't stop Malcolm Fraser reacting adversely when he got the report. And the report was large and had a lot of supplementary studies behind it. I was in Fraser's office at the time and he literally got the whole lot and threw it across the room into the bin. Because one of his staff had pointed out that in one of the supplementary research papers, in some footnote, it was quantified how much housing interest rates might increase if you were to deregulate interest rates generally. We then quickly convinced him that that would be very unwise given the constituency out there, the expectations that had been built. We needed, so he said, how on earth are you going to save me because I'm not going to back this? So we came up with the idea of a task force consisting of John Rose, his advisor, and myself, one from the Reserve Bank, John Phillips, Deputy Governor, one from Treasury, David Morgan. Our task was to break the report up into bite-sized pieces and prepare cabinet submissions on that basis and try and get a decision-making process going. From then on, as I would describe it, the reform snowball was rolling, virtually ensuring the inevitable deregulation of the whole finance sector, irrespective of who was in government. In particular, reform of the government securities markets, bank deregulation, limited foreign bank entry were all well underway by the time the Fraser government was defeated in March of '83. It was therefore inevitable in my mind, and I wrote about this in one of the magazines in advance, it was inevitable that the A-dollar would be floated in response to the next exchange rate crisis, and that crisis, given the way the rate had been set before, was in itself inevitable, and that happened in December '83. And that occurred even though at the time both Treasury and the Treasurer, Bob Hawke guaranteed me that Paul Keating never supported that, both the Treasury and the Treasurer opposed it. But as my point I'm making, it was inevitable. as it was inevitable that the Hawke government would ultimately licence foreign banks, even though they were committed to bank nationalisation in their formal platform at the 83 election. I fought hard for reform of the financial sector, not only as an important objective in itself, given the globalising trends in international finance, but also because I believed that it was essential as a first step to more broad-based reform of both monetary and fiscal policy, of the labour market, of the goods market, of competition policy, and of broader micro-reform. Specifically, how could we sustain a profligate fiscal policy or not improve the conduct of monetary policy or maintain a non-market centralised process of wage determination or a heavily protected goods market or sizable inefficiencies in infrastructure, etc., in the face of market-determined interest rates and exchange rates? These market prices would soon be buffeted by those inefficiencies and rigidities in other parts of the system, putting pressure on governments to accelerate the process of reform across the board. That was an assumption that I'd made, and it was one that I saw unfold in the course of the 80s, to some extent carried into the early 90s, with more or less bipartisan support, because the snowball was rolling and it didn't particularly matter who was there. I'm not sure how it would have worked if Mr Abbott was there saying no to every occasion, but bipartisan support basically existed throughout the entire process. There were a lot of opportunities to make short-term political points on some of those changes, and they weren't really made. However, while the trend in reform has generally been in the right direction and more reform has been achieved in some areas than others, there were some errors along the way. There are many rigidities that remain, and you couldn't say actually broadly beyond the finance sector in any major area that the process of reform is anywhere near complete. Unfortunately, in our political process, politicians tend to think that's a reform agenda, we introduce that and stop. It's actually a dynamic process and you never stop reforming. It's a lesson that's very painful in the political arena. But let me cite some examples of where I think the job didn't get done or didn't get done right, correctly, or where there's still some scope. First, the deregulation of the banks was not accompanied by the other SUREs, we called it at the time, effective prudential supervision. They went ahead and deregulated the banks, but they didn't put the prudential regulatory structures in place that would be required. Ultimately, the initial policy of the Reserve Bank and the Treasury was reversed in that process. They started out not trusting anybody, so any foreign bank that was licensed had to be licensed as a subsidiary rather than a branch, even though the Basel Accord, which was the basis for international coordination of prudential supervision, actually worked on the principle of branch, head office and branch relationships and responsibilities. So inevitably they changed that position and ditched the idea of subsidiaries and went to branches. When I was chairman of ABN AMRO, we took over BZW, for example. One condition of that takeover was that we switched from being a subsidiary to being a branch, which validated the changes that were being made in terms of prudential supervision. The second thing is it took considerable time to establish an independent Reserve Bank and to embrace inflation targeting, to get the minutes of the Reserve Bank board published, to ensure regular testimony by the Governor before the Parliament, and none of that process, to my mind, is yet complete. Specifically, the Treasury still sits on the board. The Secretary of the Treasury is still a member of the Reserve Bank board. So although you have independence of government, you don't have independence within government. And I think that's a significant constraint. And moreover, I think the inflation target has remained fixed and not varied according to prevailing circumstances, which surprised me. Now, I was one who advocated this from very early on. I wrote an academic paper in 1980 arguing the case for a genuinely independent Reserve Bank. And throughout the 80s and early 90s, I fought for an independent Reserve Bank and inflation targeting, to refocus monetary policy, if you like, and to set its objectives define its objectives more finely and completely. I have to say, as I stand here today, I'm embarrassed as to where we've ended up, because the Reserve Bank has been elevated almost beyond media and political scrutiny and allowed to irresponsibly, in my view, pursue its obsession of an anti-inflationary strategy. And the cost of that has been the flatness of the non-resource sector in our economy today. If they get a chance to put interest rates up, they put them up. They hold them there as high as they can for as long as they can. I know we had a 25-point reduction today, but the rate should be nowhere near 4.75, 4.5, 4.25, 4, whatever. They've put them up and held them up, and the whole thing is about perceived inflationary forces. Yet most of the inflationary forces I see are in fact being generated offshore, global commodity prices, food prices, world food prices, or domestically there are things like utility costs and so on, none of which are going to respond to increases in interest rates. And all you're going to do, both directly and indirectly, is grind some other sectors of the economy, the non-resource sectors of the economy, into the ground. So I stand embarrassed by where we've ended up in what was a conceptually pretty clever process all the way through. Next, the broad political and community expectations of real competition as a result of financial sector deregulation and reform, in banking in particular, have not been realised. The only significant inroads have been, I guess, in investment banking and private equity. Big Four banks are more dominant now than they ever were, operating very much as a cartel and having diminished almost all alternative sources of finance. Unfortunately, this comes as no surprise to me, given my past focus on the theory of banking, because they control, through their retail network, the $A base of the system. They have everybody else at a $A funding cost disadvantage on a daily basis. So they're in a unique position to dominate. Turn that around when they go offshore and try and buy some banks in the Midland in the UK, or a Chinese bank or a couple of American banks. It's not surprising that they are not very successful enterprises on the part of the Australian banks, for exactly the same reason. I must say, though, I expected that at some point you would get a foreign bank buying one of the Big Four, which is allowed under the bipartisan Four Pillars policy. My only way of dealing with that is to conclude that perhaps the price has always been consistently too high, or the circumstances not quite right for that decision to be taken. But I would have thought, as you see all 16 foreign banks licensed, none of them end up as substantial retail market players in this system. And the only way to do that is to buy one of the existing Big Four. Now, I've dealt with, at length with the issue of financial sector deregulation reform, as I believe it exemplifies many of the issues and processes that are fundamental to reform generally in most areas of policy. But particularly things like the need to build an effective broad-based constituency for change, the need to effectively address the various vested interests, the need to be able to influence the bureaucratic and cabinet processes, and most importantly through that process, if you want to reform, somebody has to own it and somebody has to drive it, and that has to be a consistent strategy going forward. My second area to comment on is fight back, and my failure to win an election on the basis of it. As a result, I guess it's been referred to as the longest political suicide note in Australia's political history. I entered politics with a somewhat novel idea that it would be nice for a professional economist to be treasurer. I soon found out that as I was somewhat unexpectedly made leader in 1990, that the media used to argue, that Andrew Peacock could never be Prime Minister because he wasn't an economist. Suddenly John Hewson could never be Prime Minister because he was an economist. I nevertheless took the view that with the economy having been forced into the recession we had to have, and largely through appalling mismanagement of monetary policy in the latter part of the 80s, in the context of stalling reform pretty generally, there was a need to outline a broad-based agenda for economic, social and political reform. So that's what Fightback was set out to do. Fightback set out to do. But while the circumstances clearly warranted it, and recognising the enormity of the risks inherent in such a political strategy, which many dispense with, I guess, as simply naive, particularly as it would be easily exposed to a massive scare campaign, I thought it would be something of a test to the maturity of the Australian electorate, the Australian community in so many areas. What a novel idea, as taxi drivers keep telling me, that a politician would offer an honest assessment of where we could or should go as a nation in our region of the world. So the objective of all our policies was to take a 10-year view from 1990. Where can Australia be in the year 2000 as more or less a economic political leader in the Asia-Pacific region in that 10-year period? What policies do we need to get there? So it was novel to think about what we could or should do as a nation in that region of the world, where we stood relative to that objective in those circumstances of 1990, and then what was required in policy terms across the board to maximise our potential to achieve those objectives, to maximise our potential going forward. must admit that I was perhaps the only one who believed this, but I think we came closer to winning that election than I had thought we would. There's always two polls. Who do you think's going to win, and who's, what's the two-party preferred vote? I was always way in front of who you think's going to win. I was struggling in the two-party preferred vote. And, it was just down to the wire and a handful of votes on the day. But even though our policy detail, numbers and analysis withstood the rigours of an unusually tough bureaucratic, media and political scrutiny, it was all too easy to scare the electorate by tagging me, as Keating did, as a feral abacus, as a visiting professor, and especially by focusing on a few key elements of the policy package. And I'll just pick a couple of them. The GST, of course, a new tax, and its likely impact on the cost of living, impact on our lifestyle. The sky was going to fall in, women were going to become barren, and a host of other events were claimed to follow from that implementation of the GST. He also tagged me as Captain Zero because I wanted zero tariff protection in the context of an overwhelmingly favourable package for Australian industry, but he could draw significant lessons on the likely impact on manufacturing and employment in the near term. If you combine that with my penchant for inflation targeting and refocusing the Reserve Bank to a particular objective in the context of the other objectives, it's easy to say they're not going to care about employment either. And then if you want to add to that, I wanted a workplace-based industrialisation system which allowed opting out of awards in favour of workplace agreements that could easily be sold as an attack on workers' rights. My views on welfare reform was seen as further, that is beyond the regressive GST, a tax on the poor. Health reform, well, simply I was dispensed with as expecting people to pay to go to a doctor. New superannuation arrangements that were based entirely on incentives rather than compulsion. I thought people should have a choice between those two structures of superannuation, but it caused the unions further disquiet. Things like fuel taxes, I wanted to scrap fuel excise taxes, introduce a new pricing structure for the use of road space, and that got the trucking industry's back up, and so I can go on. I was the relatively unknown new boy on the political block. Keating was the established political master, the darling of the media, the master of colour and movement. So it didn't matter that when Keating was rolled by Hawke in 1985 over a tax package that was then built around a GST, that he'd said with great passion in the Parliament that he'd die fighting for the rest of his life. I tried to make this point on many occasions. Indeed, I went as far as publishing a short manuscript, The Case for a Broad-Based GST by R.J. Hawke and P.J. Keating. But it wasn't a bestseller even at a zero price. Moreover, it didn't matter that my total package was more than fully funded. I didn't have a black hole. In fact, as it's become known in recent political debate, in fact, I deliberately understated the likely revenue from the tax changes. And I never used any of the revenue I was going to generate from privatisation, particularly the sale of Telstra, which would have raised 35 to 50 billion on the then investment banking estimates. It didn't matter that I had a bucket load of cash behind me, I was still criticised. What I tried to do was the unexpected. That is, if I'd won government, I was actually going to be the first politician to over-deliver. I said I'd give you $100 a week, but I'm going to give you $150 a week. Get used to it. I think I'd still be in government, but we never actually got that chance. One of my surprises was that business wasn't prepared to support the package either by money or by voice. A few notable exceptions, but this was an overwhelmingly favourable package to business in terms of the restructuring that took place. You could take any bit of it and say it's going to cause pain in some areas, tariffs for example, but with a very structured assistance package around it, they were clear, identifiable winners, but I was surprised they didn't come out. So in the end, it was the politics of fear that won out over the policy substance, and that's the story. But in a sense, it was an ephemeral victory for Keating, for as soon as he admitted about 6 or 8 months later that he couldn't deliver his tax cuts without a GST, the LAW tax cuts, the ones he'd legislated prior to the election, then his polls collapsed in the weekend following that, about 8 points in New South Wales and 13 in Victoria. and allowing a little blip for the arrival and departure of Alexander Downer. That was largely the margin that Howard won by in 96. My main failing was my incapacity to sell, that is, explain and market such an ambitious reform package from opposition with limited manpower and limited finance. And I must admit, with a few people behind me that had a vested interest in running dead, so I didn't quite look as strong as I might otherwise have looked. Now, that alone could be the subject of another book. I won't mention any more about it at this stage. Now, while I'm pleased in a sense that Fightback has been seen to have driven much, I should say, of policy of both sides of government since 93, with recent estimates in the media of about 80% of it having been implemented, I have some considerable disappointment how some of those changes have been made. I'll just say a few things about the GST. While Howard took it to an election, he and Costello didn't own it. They left the design and implementation of it to the Tax Policy Division of Treasury and the Australian Tax Office. They have a different view of tax reform than the rest of us. I think tax reform is not only about changing the structure of tax, but where possible, reducing the overall burden of tax. They tend to think of us as clients, and they have a business objective of maximising revenue. It's somewhat inconsistent with what I had in mind. And so that, I think that was a mistake. Going back to the point, somebody's got to own it, somebody's got to drive it. Secondly, the rate was set too low at 10%. Of course, you lost an opportunity to abolish a whole host of other taxes like payroll taxes and stamp duties and so on, which would have made a significant difference to the structure of our tax system and the functioning of our economy. Moreover, I could never understand the edict from Treasury that has dominated right through this process, that any of the revenue that's raised from consumption taxes should not be used to reduce personal tax. Now, I thought one of the principal motives of what I was on about anyway was changing the balance between direct and indirect taxation on efficiency grounds, on revenue grounds, on a whole host of grounds. So I was surprised that that carried as much weight as it did, and Howard, I think, suffered. Without the resources, we wouldn't have been able to fund any of his tax cuts. But he should have been able to use the GST restructuring process to do that. Finally, the GST is not a flexible instrument that I thought it should be. It sticks at 10%. It doesn't go up or down. It should be a flexible instrument of fiscal policy. Now, Howard was very clever politically to offer all the revenue from the GST to the states, but that's meant that it won't ever be changed easily from now on, and where you could have used it even in response to, as you've seen, a Henry tax review or a tax summit, it's always said the GST rate is not up for grabs. It could have been used as an instrument in response to the GFC with fairly immediate impact. It wasn't. I find that hard to accept. So I guess a main and regrettable legacy of Fightback has been that elections since then have been fought without much policy substance at all. I mean, one suicide is apparently enough. Policy documents, if you can call them that these days, are little more than a list of aspirations and objectives with little detail of how and when those objectives might be achieved. Howard won the 96 election essentially without any policy against Keating, who was increasingly on the nose. Rudd won in 07 with little more than policy objectives. For example, a key populist element of his education revolution was a laptop for every student in high school. When you saw them come to government, they worked out the cost of that, not only the direct cost in terms of the cost of laptops, but recognition that there wasn't a school in Australia that had the power capacity to support a classroom full of laptops, or didn't have the teachers trained adequately to support a classroom full of laptops. The costs, of course, ran pretty much out of control. Finally, let me say a couple of things about current policy. After the 93 election, on the first day back to Parliament, Keating took me aside, said he wanted to ask me how I was, and said he wanted to apologise for some of the things he'd said to me, or said about me, some of the names he'd called me. I was just about passing out with surprise at this point, but he did. And this was right in the middle of the Parliament. He just took me aside in front of the Governor-General and made this point. And then he said to me, he said, I respect you and I could actually easily have lost to you. You might notice he hasn't found it so easy to have lost to John Howard, but he didn't. He said to me he could easily have lost to me. But he said, and I quote, "What I needed to understand is that politics, to me, mate, is just a game. And I will say or do whatever I have to win." Now, perhaps naively, I'd never thought of politics and government in those terms. I'd never thought of it as a game. As I said before, I thought of it more as a business. Well, if it was a game in 1993, that game has now been elevated to an art form in 2011. Politics today is little more than a daily contest to win the 24-hour media cycle with the hope of then winning the next poll. Each day is another issue, another location, another stunt, with an accommodating media mostly intent on simply capturing the message of the day, rather than with minimal scrutiny, I guess. Policies have become little more than focus group-driven sound bites or slogans or even mere dot points. Stop the boats, achieve a budget surplus, pay back the debt, have an education revolution, or whatever. It's all about short-term opportunism and short-term populism. Policy has become a race to the bottom with a victory over form of colour and movement over substance, I should say. Victory of form and of colour and movement over substance. In the process, issues are badly managed, problems are left to drift, and opportunities are lost. Take, for example, the considerable challenge of climate change and the need to put a price on carbon as, I think, an essential response to that challenge. Both sides of politics and the Greens went to the 2007 election supporting an ETS. An essential part of Rudd's victory was a mandate to sign Kyoto and to get on with responding to the climate change challenge. At the time, he had widespread community support, in some polls as much as 75%. But he lost his nerve in early 2010. If he'd gone to, he started right, and he reiterated it several times, including on a couple of occasions to me personally. He had an ambitious timetable: Garnaut, white papers, green papers, legislation, passage through the parliament, double dissolution if he didn't get what he wanted. Then he lost his nerve in 2010. But my view is if he'd gone to a double dissolution election in February of last year, he would have won. And although his proposed ETS had its problems, we would at least be well on the way, having built that constituency, being able to exploit it at that time. Progress was then lost as the issue then cost him and Turnbull their leadership. And the Copenhagen, of course, failed to endorse the urgency for change, further eroding community support. Gillard went to the 2010 election in unusual circumstances, rushed unseemingly to an early election after she was, as a knife rather than moved her into the leadership. But she had three policies in that election on price on carbon. The first one was a long-term commitment to an ETS. The second one was a citizens' assembly who would advise on whether or not to put a price on carbon and how to do that. And then, of course, there's the famous statement, no carbon tax under a government that I lead. On winning government, she established a multi-party committee, which the opposition failed to join, even though their policies, their direct action policies, put implicit prices on carbon. So this was Gillard selling out basically to the Greens. She then amazingly announced, somewhat out of the blue, but back in February, but apparently to head off a leak, that she would break her election commitment and put a price on carbon, but providing no details for several months. Abbott couldn't believe his luck. He was left with a free kick on a daily basis between February and July when she finally brought down the detail, a kick that he will sustain, I believe, every day between now and the next election. The point is the essential constituency for change and reform is now almost completely squandered. Legislation has been finally introduced and forced through the parliament. The big polluters are the winners. You know, they've got the best government money can buy. Abbott's committed in blood to actually abolish the tax. I think he will, and he'll campaign flat out so that the next election, as far as I'm concerned, will be a referendum on carbon pricing. And as things stand now with Gillard as leader, it's hard to see how the Labor government can win. And I don't know how many years, indeed maybe decades, that the whole debate gets set back as a consequence of what was appalling issues management through that process. So the bottom line is that the opportunity has been lost to make a decisive start on what Rudd said, and I agree, is the moral imperative of this century. And it may well have been a mechanism by which we could have launched a host of new industries through alternative energies and related technologies, which also has been lost. So what a sorry tale, what a case study of how not to design and implement a major policy. Good policy is now constrained, you might even say being destroyed, by politics and the political process. Constituencies for change and reform are hard to build, they're costly to build, but they are so easily lost. Rudd had a unique mandate to break out of the constraints of the 24-hour media cycle and to lead, but he succumbed and he squandered that opportunity. As we've seen more recently in New Zealand, I think electorates actually do vote for leadership. They don't necessarily like the leader, or they don't necessarily like all the policies, but they will vote for leadership. They will reward leadership, and I think that's a lesson that has to be learnt in this country. The policy challenges facing governments and policy authorities of the developed world today, both in magnitude and urgency, are unprecedented. In the broad, the challenge is, of course, to make a transition to a low debt, low carbon world. But, you know, we really are in uncharted waters. In my 40 years of predicting major events, I've been able to get most of them right. I've been able to see all the recessions we've had, the stock market crashes, periods of stagflation, globalised floating, whatever, the GFC. But right now I feel very uncertain about where we are likely to go from here and how the management processes here, but more importantly in Europe and the United States, are going to unfold. For a number of reasons. Firstly, we have little historical experience to draw on in current circumstances. Secondly, the orders of magnitude of the recent changes in policy are staggering. And we used to teach in my time as a professor a course on the limits of policy limitations, the limits of fiscal policy, for example, and contemplating increases in budget deficits of more than a couple of % of GDP was generally ruled out as politically unlikely. We've had massive changes in GDP, budget deficits to GDP. I think I saw Ireland went from surplus to deficit by about 17 percentage points to GDP. We did 5 or 6 relative to GDP from surplus to deficit. The US went from near balance to near 10% of GDP, the UK, and so on. I mean, these are unprecedented orders of magnitude. And you know, in politics, it's easy to give money away, but very soon a benefit becomes a right that's hard to take it back. And you're seeing that now. And they've had, you know, a lot of debt shuffling, a lot of periods of low, near zero interest rates, significant quantitative easing. These are orders of magnitude we have not seen in our history. Associated with that, we've got enormous volatility in stock markets, in financial prices, exchange rates, and exchange rates. And they're extreme. Those volatilities are extreme. 400 or 500 daily point movements in the Dow up and down, one day to the next, staggering orders of magnitude. The economics profession, I think, is also polarising in what to do in current circumstances. At one end, you've got those who believe 100% in austerity measures, pull back budget deficits, pay down debt, irrespective of the short to medium term costs in terms of growth. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got those who say if you keep playing that game, you'll tip the world into a global recession, or at least a series of rolling recessions. If you get it completely wrong, you risk depression. So that the political tolerances, they think, are much less than is going to be required. And in economics, of course, our own macro models don't predict these things very well. Things like the global financial crisis have to be usually treated as exogenous shocks to the system rather than being able to be explained endogenously within the model. And in fact, you've got to go back to the 20s and 30s to find models that exist that attempt to explain the evolution of the possibility of a crisis of the sort of magnitudes that we've seen. I guess if you look at it on a daily basis, the situation's being driven entirely by financial markets. And our financial markets act, and they act instantaneously on the issues and judgments at hand. Governments, of course, don't act, they react. And usually after they've had a series of committee meetings, cabinets, parliaments, G20s, or whatever. So financial markets have been left to trade the politics, to second guess the politics, as much as they've been left to trade the economic data as it is released. The current situation obviously calls for long-term policy thinking and substantive structural reform in all of the key countries, which is almost impossible given the political contests that exist in each of those countries, pretty much along the lines of our 24-hour media cycle. And related to all that, we have enormous social and civil unrest, where the political tolerance is running out, particularly in the countries where the austerity measures require a change of lifestyle or a change of culture Greece, Spain, Italy, for example, as much as they require just an economic adjustment. This is a very significant constraint, and it's frightening governments already, way short of where they need to be. I don't think the austerity packages we're seeing are anywhere near as big as they will need to be to actually do the job. I was in May of last year, I visited the Irish Prime Minister with the Trilateral Commission that I sit on, and he gave us then Prime Minister, I should say, gave us a very detailed account of the fairly draconian responses to their debt crisis. Cutting wages and salaries and government spending by 20-25% across the board, nationalising banks and so on. That was in May of last year. In November of last year, you had Ireland in default. And I think you're going to see a similar process country by country across Europe as these circumstances unfold. And finally, I guess the two objectives of low debt and low carbon are seen as competing rather than complementary. And I think that is another major constraint. So global leaders mostly seem at sea on all this. If the short-term politics win, we could be in for a very long period of very flat economic activity at best, what we might call several lost decades in terms of low growth and a very significant constraint on further increases in improvements, I should say, in standard living. I would cite you the experience of Japan. Go back to the late 1980s, there wasn't anyone in the world who predicted that the success story of the post-war period, the economic miracle of the post-war period, Japan could actually slip into a period of rolling recessions and deflation for the best part of a couple of decades. They've had a series of fiscal stimulatory packages, almost one a year. They've had near zero interest rates. They've had a multiplicity of prime ministers, almost as many as fiscal packages, and they haven't got out of the mess at all. Mostly because they were in a process of denial for most of that early part of that period, for the bulk of the first decade anyway. They were not prepared to admit the magnitude of the non-performing loans problem, and they were not prepared to address the very difficult task of unbundling what we call Japan Inc., that incestuous and corruptible relationship between the bureaucracy, the corporate sector, the finance sector, and the LDP. I mean, it's been the very essence of the success. It was the very essence of the success through the early part of the post-war period. It then became the massive liability from which they had to unbundle and reform. What staggered me was how far they were prepared to go in denial before they responded to the magnitude of the problem. They indeed pushed the Japanese economic and financial system almost to the brink of collapse, rather than to address the magnitude of those problems. When I look at Europe today, I fear the same. Here we have a group attempting to save the euro, 17 member countries. The euro, I must admit, I was a Eurosceptic back in my IMF days. We talked a lot about how the world would unfold. You could see a common market. I could never see a common currency being developed, let alone sustained. I was wrong. It's developed, but it's very difficult to sustain because you need a much greater degree of monetary and fiscal policy coordination than you've got, particularly fiscal policy in today's markets and today's circumstances. You need a much greater level of monetary union than you've got, and you need much stronger leadership in individual countries within that framework. And so I am as pessimistic about what's happening in Europe as I was about what's happened in Japan. And how different is the crisis that's emerging in the United States as well, with the budget deficit now approaching 10% of GDP, with debt approaching 100% of GDP, a politically weakened president against a hostile Congress, with little hope of substantive policy in the next 12 months at least, because it's an election year. So the need for a substantial economic, social and political reform, or for policy leadership, has never been as great or as widespread as it is in the industrial world today. Yet unfortunately, the political capacity to deliver this has probably never been more compromised than it is today. Let me conclude with just a quote from Keynes, which I think you'll all know, but I think is very important. The ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they are right and when they are wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. Practical men who believe themselves to be excuse me, quite exempt from any intellectual influence, are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Madmen in authority who hear voices in the air are distilling their frenzy from some academic scribbler of a few years before. What more can and should we be doing as a profession in these most challenging and frustrating circumstances? Thank you.
John, well done. That was wonderful. Thank you very much. By design, we've got time for questions from the audience. Just a pretty simple request. Just wait for the microphone to come around. Try and record things. Second, identify yourself quickly and try and keep the questions short so we can get in as many as possible. Start there.
Thanks very much, Dr. Hewson. You probably won't be surprised that I found your survey of the recent history of carbon pricing rather depressing. As unlikely as it is, do you see any glimmers of hope on the current horizon moving forward over the next several years?
Look, I honestly believe Abbott will win. He worked for me for 3 years. I'm convinced that he'll actually deliver if he can to abolish it. And it'll set the course back a long time in this country. I guess we'll move on to a world where we'll only do something in the future the bulk of the rest of the industrial world at least does it. And that would include China and India. You know, the probability of that is not great. And it's staggering given the magnitude of the problem and the urgency with which we should be addressing that. But I can't believe that in all this process, you know, we can say that we've had years of debate. But when Gillard made her decision public in February that she was going to put a price on carbon, I was staggered that she didn't take every opportunity from then on out to try and link the science, which identifies the magnitude of the problem and the urgency of the problem, to the sort of solutions that are available and then why she's picked the one she's done and so on. There's a very significant education process in building an effective constituency, and to let it sit there for 5 months as a vacuum has done irreparable damage. So I'm very pessimistic at how quickly you might turn it around. I mean, I was very pessimistic back in the late 90s, early part of this decade, when we started a group called the National Business Leaders Forum on Sustainable Development, with the purpose of encouraging the business community to recognise some of the business opportunities that would exist in terms of an appropriate response to the challenge of climate change. For the first few years we met among ourselves. We then finally raised some cash and brought Al Gore to Australia. Not long after that you had An Inconvenient Truth and the Stern Report, and the world seemed to move very quickly. So I pin some hope on the fact that maybe those sort of circumstances will re-emerge. I think Obama will be re-elected by default because the other lot look pretty ordinary. And he may, in a second term, go back and embrace climate change. And if somebody like that plays a leadership role, I mean, we're talking about leadership. If you get a significant leadership role being played, I think it can turn things around very quickly. But it will take an Obama or a couple of others to actually move and make a stand and take on Congress, in his case, more broadly the international community, and I think it may change. So that's our hope. But it won't be driven domestically if Abbott's in government, in my view, and the probability is very high as things stand that he will be in government.
Hi, Maria Taflaga from ANU. I just want to know, given your own experience and your allusions to the Abbott opposition, what responsibilities and what does the opposition owe to the public, especially when it tries to weigh good policy with good politics and winning elections?
Well, I lost an election trying to prove the point that I thought we had substantial responsibility to do that, to be constructive and to stimulate debate. And in those days, it was the case. We did have very substantive debates in the 70s and 80s too about some of the processes that I mentioned. And as I said, there was widespread bipartisan support. But now it's a game, you know, where nobody carries any particular responsibility. The government doesn't seem to feel that it's responsible to govern, in the sense that I defined it here in terms of addressing issues, solving problems and so on. The opposition's going to take every opportunity to score a political point on the day. Abbott's a master of the negative, and as we've seen, he's been very successful at it. Now, I don't say that Abbott won't actually say something positive between now and the next election, because I think he must. But, you know, there are those who within the party who believe you can win by just being negative. I hope he doesn't just stay there. But it's an important strategic choice in politics as to when you actually make some of those public announcements, because you set yourself up for attack. And I got a lot of criticism for daring to release my policies 18 months before the election. I took the simplistic view that we needed to market them pretty heavily for 18 months, otherwise we didn't have a chance of getting across the line. But Abbott won't take those sort of risks, and you know, as I say, most people think that one political suicide note is enough.
I would have liked to hear your comments on the recession that we were meant to have, that Keating was implementing when we were Treasury. Was Keating too much of a captive of the Treasury? And should we allow that sort of situation to continue where most of our economic advice is coming from one authority?
Keating's a very interesting study in this, because if you look at the way he started out, he didn't appear at all for about 18 months. Didn't do any media conferences and so on. Towards the end of his time, he was commenting on every piece of economic data as it was released. He did break away to some extent from Treasury, although not being sure of his own standing in the field, he was always very, very guarded. And we've had a succession of heads of Treasury, particularly in the 70s and early 80s, which really were dominant individuals. Go back to the era of the public sector as a whole of the seven dwarfs who pretty much control governments of whatever persuasion. And some of them have explained to me how, you know, they're there for the long haul, the other guys just come and go around them. One of the things we tried to do was to break that down a bit by opening up the fields of advice and making them compete. And they hated having to argue the case with the governor, for example, in a monetary policy committee about what should be done. PM&C, of course, were even more extreme in their views, and that forced a debate. I don't know how you change that, because so much of it depends on the personalities. I think that more transparency, more public transparency and accountability in the decision-making processes is an important way to do it. I don't know why we don't have the Treasurer cross-examined in detail on a regular basis by parliamentary committees, for example, or other mechanisms that can be used. I mean, they do a little bit, and they would say that they answer all the questions that they need to in question time, but we don't have a very American style, if you like, committee process. We've got a rudimentary committee process, but that's another way in which you can hold people accountable and have them express their views. But it is important that they are not just captives of a particular audience and a particular advisor. And it's one of the reasons why I said that the Reserve Bank board is really not independent. Apart from the political appointments that get put on there, the Secretary of the Treasury still sits on that board. And that's a legacy of the days where they controlled the entire process. You know, if you're a business person or a union leader or whatever that's put on that board, and you're fed the official material from the Reserve Bank staff, and you've got a strong governor and a strong Treasury Secretary arguing the case, not too many of those independent directors are going to make much of a stand within that context. And if they do, they don't last very long. I think one of them is employed here.
Colin Lyons is my name, Dr. Hewson. I'd like to ask you two questions. Firstly, a quick response to the question you were asked by Mike Willesee, which the press at the time said had a significant bearing on the outcome of that election, about a birthday cake. And secondly, I'd like to call on your experience in since you left politics in postgraduate education. Do you feel that the current funding module in Australia for tertiary education in particular is appropriate, given the rate at which fees have increased and the dependence of universities on sheer numbers rather than quality? I'd like you to comment on both those issues.
Other than in the Crawford School.
Yeah, look, the answer to the first one is I should have just turned to Willesee and said, get stuffed. But having said that, I don't think it was that significant. In our internal polling, where we did all the marginal seats, about 3,500 people a night, the GST disappeared as an issue about 10 days out from the election. And what really bit in that election was the healthcare that was targeted in key marginal seats, particularly in Victoria. Leaflets went out everywhere saying that a mum and 2 kids going to the doctor cost $92, which is complete rubbish. But those sort of scare campaigns really work. But yes, I mean, the receive view out in the wider world is that my birthday cake example, cost me. The tragedy is, if you go back and look at the answer, I think it's correct. It's a bit of a problem. On tertiary education, look, we've had a whole mess of attempts at how best to do this. I mean, in simple terms, when universities were allowed to have full fee-paying students from offshore to complement the number of students that were funded in some form onshore, that gave you the drive for numbers that we've seen. I mean, I had a big fight with the Vice-Chancellor at the time I was Dean of the Macquarie Graduate School of Management because I refused to lower entry standards to get more students. I just wanted to stay with the quality of my students coming in with, 5 to 7 years of management experience, not just work experience on top of a top first degree. I thought that was very important constraint, and interestingly, towards the end of my time in the Financial Times survey, we ranked number 1 in the world, ahead of Stanford, Harvard and everyone else, in terms of quality of our students. And I do think that there has been a dumbing down of education as a result of amalgamations of CIEs and universities, as a result of some of the funding practices that we've seen, where numbers really have dominated. And it has become a numbers game. The more students you could get through the door, the better. What worries me is there's no focus on these issues now. I mean, it was, 4 years ago, the Bradley report on higher education, maybe 5 years ago, where she said something like 15 of the 38 universities were non-viable. That was in the halcyon days of foreign students. Today, with the foreign student numbers having dropped off, I wonder how many more of those 38 universities are non-viable. What worries me is that amalgamating them, which is a fundamental process that needs to be gone through, because otherwise they're all going to start having their own law school, their own business school, their own marine biology school, whatever. That is a disastrous fragmentation and waste of money. But the cost of those amalgamations is enormous. I was told of one study done recently to amalgamate Charles Sturt, Southern Cross and Southern Queensland. It was about $600 million. Now, we should, in our education revolution, be addressing those, because what I see is the standard of higher education has been driven down as a result of a combination of factors, and a large part of that is the funding models, and I didn't spend time on any one of them, but been a succession of funding models that have compounded that problem. Certainly driven us to numbers rather than quality of students. Yeah.
Hi, Dr. Houston. I wanted to ask, given our system of representative government, how do you think a politician should balance what can be described as policy making by elites with responsiveness to public opinion?
Policy by first part?
Policy making by elites with responsiveness to public
by elites. Look, it's a very difficult balance to strike, I think. I mean, we've come to a world where focus group research tells you what people think is important, and therefore we have our politicians out there like parrots mouthing those words back to them and calling them policies. To some extent, you do need to recognise the mood of the electorate when you're trying to make change. But on the other hand, you'd also have to lead. And in some of these areas where, these difficult areas, you need leadership. And you're seeing a paucity of leadership in individual countries. I noticed in Greece and Italy, for example, both prime ministers have been removed and been replaced by professional economists. That'll be good or bad for our reputation in this field, because Mario Monti actually sits on the Trilateral Commission, of which I'm a member. He's a good economist. I don't know how he's going to handle the political cut and thrust, having not been a politician in Italy, let alone in Europe, beyond that. So, those balances are very hard to strike. I went too far the one way in terms of policy substance and process, but a lot of others, I mean, one of the problems with politics today is we're attracting the wrong people. There's an increasing attraction of what we call apparatchiks, people who've been part of the political process, student politics, unions, local councils, parties, organisations, and ministerial offices and so on. And that's not a good thing. Also, a lot of the people, I did a survey in '96, and looked at where people were before they entered Parliament, what they roughly earned. I think 85% of them earned the average wage before they went into Parliament, and the parliamentary base salary was more than double the average wage. A sad commentary that a lot of people went into politics for the money, and therefore they're unlikely to take principal positions on issues if they think they might lose their seat or lose some benefit. So, it is a very complex situation from which I have to try and answer your question.
Time for one last question. Ian?
Good. John, Ian Buchanan, I chair the Advisory Council of the Crawford School. I would say that John Hewson on global economics reminds me of the first time I heard Al Gore on global warming. It leaves me with a sense of what to do. Now, your quote that you picked from Keynes ends with, what can we in the profession do? The Advisory Council of Crawford, which is a school of economics and government, has got some very smart people from public, private, academia working together. The key question we wrestle with in those meetings is where and how to find intervention points in order to bring a greater, let's call it knowledge-based, science-based, evidence-based input into current policy. So from your perspective, where would you see, say, top 3 points at which a school like Crawford and an advisory council with deep reach into business and into government can potentially stop what sounds like a train wreck in progress? Thank you.
Look, it's a very important question. We were actually, Tom and I were talking about it, Bruce and I were talking about it before I came in here, as to how well, I actually started by lamenting the fact that the days of substantial influence from academia to the political process, to the government process, okay, it's probably okay at the bureaucratic level, not great at the political level, because they're not all that interested in genuine policy debate and discussion. And think back over the years where we've had halcyon days where research centres and where think tanks and where individual academics, perhaps through personal relationship, perhaps because the government had some structure of consulting these people. They were halcyon days of influence, I think, for at least some benchmarking against received theory, rather than just everything being a political shot from the hip. One of the things I did when I was working for Lynch and Howard was to organise regular forums for them to actually go and sit with a cross-section of business leaders or a group of academics. As a staff member, chief of staff or chief advisor, I could make sure they went and stayed for the whole half day and listened. You can't be sure they're listening, but you make sure that they're there and that they attend. Otherwise, you insult a whole host of people that you don't need to get offside. And that sort of process worked because they did actually get to test. I mean, I used to feed them a bit, like the Treasury says this and the Reserve Bank says that, ask these blokes, and you get a reaction which would temper their view. But the lack of competition in advice is a major weakness in our system. Within government, the lack of competition in advice. Treasury is still dominant, irrespective of who's been there, although the Reserve Bank has a level of independence, as I described. But they are not that well inclined to actually listen to outside points of view either. The Reserve Bank prides itself on its capacity to influence the expectations of the financial market, by whether you get invited to lunch there or you go to the same cocktail parties or the same barbecues on a weekend. They feed out a little nod and a wink that, interest rates might go up. They don't actually have to put them up then because the expectation is that they're going to go up and it works as a second layer of that instrument. So it works. There are failings at the bureaucratic level, and even though the relationships are probably better than they are at the political level. And a lot of it does depend on the individuals. But I think academics can start to challenge them. I mean, in the past, I've organised major conferences, economic conferences, which he did in the 80s, where the basic requirement was the Treasurer and his opposite number spoke at that conference. And then the Governor spoke and the Secretary of the Treasury spoke. And you could use a level of influence to ensure that the substance was there. And, of course, the other speakers all fell into line. Sometimes you build it around a larger, more significant international speaker. There's no easy option, but I do think it's fundamental to what's got to be done, that link between academia and government has got to be dramatically improved. And as I see this school, this has got a unique opportunity just by the proximity of the school to the political process. You'd figure you'd have access. And you'd probably eat in the same restaurants and pass them here and there, but getting them to listen is very difficult. And again, though, it's part of the process of being a 24-hour media game where they don't really care. You know, it's very few occasions where they actually have to get down to defend the substance, the detail, and there's very little parliamentary debate. Take a bill, you don't have open debate. You have each side on message. So you can go and listen to the parliamentary speeches, they're all the same. The Labor guys all say the same thing, people all say the same thing. And you've got to break that down, and I think you can, and I think you, as individuals, you can challenge them. You know, get involved more in the public debate on media and on Sky, in newspapers, in blogs all over the place. There are endless opportunities, in fact, to start challenging them and sort of embarrassing them into doing something about it. I remember in the 80s we set up Macquarie Economics, which I established as sort of the first influential business group, which Keating used to refer to before I went into politics as the Joy Boys from Macquarie Bank, because we used to point out where all the downsides on his policy positions and predicted the stock market crash in 87, this sort of thing. You can have influence, you just got to work a mechanism by which you can achieve it. I'll just say one thing. On my notes here I put one quote from Mark Twain, which I'd like to end on. Mark Twain gave a speech entitled Theoretical and Practical Morals. It was a speech to the New Vagabonds Club of London in July 1899. And the line I want you to go away with is, reflection is the beginning of reform.